Welcome to Advancing Cyber, where we dive into cybersecurity issues driving today's headlines and business decisions. In every episode, we bring together a cyber attorney, a policy expert, and a tech leader to cut through the noise and talk real-world implications beyond the tech or legal jargon. I'm Cristin Flynn Goodwin, your host and an expert in cybersecurity law and incident response. From escalating nation-state cyber attacks to the implications of new laws and policies, let's advance the cyber discussion right now. Today's show features three experts that I'm thrilled to know and introduce. Jason Kikta is the CISO of Automox, where he recently joined after a long career in the U.S. military as part of the United States Marine Corps. Jen Ellis is one of the world's most well-known cyber policy voices and leads her own cyber policy firm, NextJen Security, after years with Rapid7 and other well-known companies. Jessica Herrera-Flanigan, I was realizing that next year we'll have known each other for 25 years, which is kind of crazy because we must have started cyber very, very young. And Jess is an attorney and partner with Monument Advocacy and has held leadership roles at Twitter, Univision, and in the U.S. government. As a reminder, the comments that you hear today may reflect legal opinions, but do not constitute legal advice. So let's jump into it. We have to start with CrowdStrike and the implications of the recent CrowdStrike incident. We're coming up on about a month post-incident, and recovery is largely complete, although CrowdStrike and Microsoft have both talked about some work that they have to do on their development processes for their updates and for Microsoft on its kernel processes. Jason, can you take us through what happened and what it means for CISOs when they're taking updates from security companies and rapidly deploying those patches?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me, Cristin. So I think there's a few critical distinctions to understand here about what makes these updates a bit special. When antivirus and EDR products started out, they had a need to view what was happening within an operating system's kernel, that lowest part of the operating system that is central to all of its operations. So rather than running in a user context or an administrator's context, they were designed to run in this what's called kernel mode and to have these kernel level drivers. And several years back, Apple made a rather large investment to essentially kick all applications out of their kernel and give them instead a series of APIs, make these sort of, think of them as almost regulated calls to the kernel to get the information that they needed, but to not actually run code within that space, which is a dangerous space in which to operate. And Microsoft, at the same time, had a consent decree from the EU that gave them the choice of you can either develop these APIs, which would be, to be sure, costly and expensive, and force Defender to use that as well, or keep it open for everyone. And Microsoft appears to have kept it open for everyone. So CrowdStrike, like really every other EDR vendor on the market, had these kernel mode drivers. And they give their customers an ability to stay back a version or two on their latest agent, that code that they run on the local system, but they don't give you that ability with signatures. And that makes sense from a business perspective and an operational perspective as well, right? You buy these EDR products and you especially spend the money to buy a solution like CrowdStrike, a high-end solution, because you want to get those newest, latest, greatest indicators hot off the press. You want to get them into your production environment as quickly as humanly possible, right? Because that's potentially covering a fast emerging threat, and it serves as one of the primary means of detection for modern enterprises. And there has been this race with vendors over the last several years when you look especially at their marketing, where, well, we have 20 minutes to detection. We have 7 minutes to detection. And so there's been this sort of side race between the marketing departments to get that loop faster and faster and faster from the time that an EDR vendor's intelligence team identifies a new threat to create the signatures, validate the signatures, test them, and push them out globally to all customers. And the fact that CrowdStrike, by the way, was able to push this out globally within such a short period of time is an absolute testament to their engineering success, right? That is not a small thing to do. That is a huge lift. The downside was that they had essentially an out-of-bounds read issue, buffer overflow in more common parlance, where they had expected 20 inputs and they got 21. And so it caused this crash. And in any other product, if it was IT endpoint management like my company makes, or desktop software, or just about anything else, the program would have had this bug, crashed, and you could have, come in and fixed it and recovered it. But because it was running in the kernel, it caused the kernel to crash. And because EDR is one of the very first things that an operating system loads, because you want to be protected immediately, it started this infinite boot loop where the systems were just restarting, and then they would reach the, as everyone calls it, the blue screen of death error screen each and every time. So that was very challenging. And then we had another security imperative that made it even worse, because the raft of, if you go back, I think 10, 15 years, to where you had people leaving laptops in cabs, losing them, getting them stolen, and it would have like these big spreadsheets filled with PII on them. And that loss of personally identifiable information was sort of the start of like information regulation. There was a big push on it. I remember this when I was in DOD, that this was just a very big deal. And the solution that everyone came up with in the industry was full disk encryption, right? And so in Microsoft's case, that was BitLocker. And so Microsoft did a good job of getting a rather healthy investment across the industry, really across its entirety of its user base, of using BitLocker. And that's fantastic, except you don't give those keys, that decryption key for BitLocker, to a normal employee. You hold those in escrow for the IT team, because you very rarely need them. And when they're used, the IT team should be the one to use them. And if you have to give it to the user, you do that out of band, the user uses it, you rotate the key and you move on. But the way to recover from this, the preferred way, was to boot in a safe mode, but that only works if you have that BitLocker key. So we entered this sort of catch-22 phase where the simplest path to recovery was infeasible for many corporations, because now they needed to distribute these keys to the entirety of their user base in parallel, get them to boot in a special mode in Windows, a process that those users had never done before, and then go and delete a very specific file. I don't know about you, but I don't feel comfortable telling any user, hey, here's what I need you to do. Here's this simple 20-step process. And if you can just bang through that, that would be great. No, by the way, like, how do you get it to them if all their computers are offline? So that was very painful. You could do the reboots and stuff. But the point is that I do hope that this spurs investment on Microsoft's part to close out the kernel and limit that access. It will not be quick. It will not be a simple undertaking, but it will make for safer computing, because nothing is going to change that imperative of, if you want EDR and certain other security products to function properly, they need to be getting data out of the kernel. They need to be pulling that out in real time. And you can either provide them a safe way to do it or a dangerous way to do it. Now, that said as well, what happened to CrowdStrike, this failure in their testing, is really odd. Like, I don't know that would have happened to SentinelOne or McAfee or ESET or some of the other vendors. Like, that is a really weird series of events. So I don't know that this is some new systemic risk. This
I have such a different point of view on that.
Awesome.
And I was like,
Jen,
right? It's like, I have to say, firstly, I was complete heart eyes over everything, because that was such a great explanation, Jason. It was beautiful. Also, although I've done many webcasts with you before, I've never appreciated before what a perfect voice for podcasts you have. I would actually like to request just a clip of him saying infinite boot loop over and over again. But here's the thing, and I feel bad saying this, because I've worked with, great technology companies, but let's be honest, they're all a shit show. You know why? Because they're groups of humans, and to err is human, after all, as we know. And actually, what Jason said, this thing about this like constant push to get this stuff out quickly, to be first, to be ready, to be there. Like, the company I used to work for made a vulnerability management solution. The pressure from customers to have those checks out immediately that a thing was known. And I get it. I get why. Because, you as a security professional inside the organization, the customer has such enormous pressure on themselves to be finding the issue and mitigating the risk. And you're in a race against the attackers, right? Like, the clock is ticking. But that level of pressure that's being pushed onto those vendors, and let's be honest, most companies realistically are fairly under-resourced for what they need to get done, particularly in the tech sector where hiring people is always hard and there's a huge amount of competition for good experienced people. People can't afford market rate. So you're ending up in a situation where these things are happening quickly. You're trying to turn around a response quickly. You've got a bunch of humans. Some might be out sick. Some might be off on vacation. You're probably understaffed, you're under-resourced, and you're trying to get this stuff done and everything's chaos. And I really think that this could happen to any tech company. And and I'm not saying that to condemn the sector. I love technology companies. I've worked with lots of them. But I just think a lot of people are kind of saying that this is a very specific thing. And yes, it's a weird set of circumstance. I agree. And I would say that if you make a thing like this with this potential impact and this potential reach, then you should be looking at how to implement very stringent develop and release processes. But I actually think to err is kind of normal. That's why we have vulnerabilities and everything.
Then I've got to ask, I think that, Jason, you brought up the consent decree. And it does raise the question of whether the vulnerability in the process actually started 20 years ago. I mean, that consent decree is about 20 years old. And Jess, I'm curious if you think that there's a model for governments when regulatory bodies are now entering consent decrees out into the world where maybe they need to be time bound. Maybe there needs to be some sort of a process to think about what is the security implication of something at 5 years, at 10 years, at 15 years, because the technology, the threat vectors, the world's going to change. And so informed consent in 2004 or 7 looks very different from informed consent now. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, before we get there, I'm going to say, Jane and Jason, you're going to find yourselves maybe being called as expert witness based on what we just heard on the oddness of the testing failures, because if we talk about the legal issues, that's going to be the core issue of what we're going to see and when we see the legal posturing that's building up in this case. But Cristin, to your question, I think the problem is setting that time period. And that's why it's never been set, because it could be one day, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. And you could try to artificially and arbitrarily set time period, but I don't know if that's possible. And I think it's going to become even harder as we're seeing these advances in technology from AI and quantum and things like that. So I don't know how you do it. And I don't think the governments and the regulatory bodies in particular have the expertise to be able to do it.
The only reason I would say that I consider this to be a bit of this couldn't happen to anyone is that this had a 100% failure rate, right? So this was no live testing was done, which is really unusual for the industry. But I completely agree with your point, Jen, that this is, to err is human. We have a massive amount of bugs in the industry. The number of CVEs are going up, not down. Now, that is not to say software is necessarily getting less secure. I think as a general, getting more secure, we're getting better at finding CVEs. But that said, that curve is still pretty darn steep. So, it's not getting better at the rate which we would hope. And I think a lot of this comes back to the fundamental issue that we have in computing today, especially in cybersecurity, is that computers are not engineered for safety, right? That is just not the world that we built. Everyone has a general purpose computing system on their desktop. And that's a really odd thing to me in 2024, because I remember when I started learning about computers in the 80s and 90s and being told oh, this won't be the future. Don't worry. We still won't be running these general purpose computers, these general purpose operating systems. People have very specific things, a lot closer to what you would see in an iPhone, that type of operating system that is very purpose built, but you can't just run arbitrary programs and arbitrary code on that. And we have evolved general purpose operating systems like Linux, Mac OS, Windows to have some of those characteristics, but we haven't gone all the way. And we haven't really gone out and done a fundamental rethinking of computing. And I feel like that's where regulators and governments are falling short, is they're trying to slap Band-Aids on situations. And as we're going to discuss later on, AI seems to be falling in that same bucket. But they're not thinking about what are the conditions that we want to set? What is the future of computing that we want for society? And how do we incentivize that?
So firstly, on the point about the testing, yes, I agree. Like, that is shocking that it does seem to have not had any, and you don't want to see like evidence of that happening again. So just to be clear, I agree on that point. In terms of the government piece, I think they are looking at what they want the future state to be. I think the problem is well, firstly, I think when you look at what the future state is you want to be, it's a little bit like saying, I want world peace. Yes, and how do you expect to get there? And so I think, everybody knows that they would like to have safe, reliable software, but that's not the same thing as like what it actually takes to get there. I think the problem is that, one, we have a huge legacy problem, and when I say we have a legacy problem that we add to every single day, right? Like, all technology is now legacy, right? That's one thing. The second thing is we don't know what to do about open source, and open source isn't everything. So that's a problem. And there's a lot of complexity around how the incentives work because they all work in the wrong direction. I mean, I know you know all of this stuff, but I do think like governments are struggling with, I was part of the working group that the UK government had for its code of practice for software resilience, which it just ran a consultation on that literally like just closed. And it was really interesting because, they had a bunch of very knowledgeable people in this group working on this. A lot of the conversation kind of sounded as if you were working on a basis of, well, if we start development tomorrow, what will it look like? And I'm like, that's great, but it's also not realistic of where we are. So this is the challenge, is like, as you try and build these things, how do you account for the fact that open source isn't everything? How do you account for compiling, not coding? How do you, how do you account for legacy and the huge problem how do you account for sectors where people will spend millions of dollars with Microsoft every year to get Microsoft to continue to support a system that is beyond legacy, right? A system that is no longer available anywhere on the market and hasn't been for years. And companies will go to them and say, we will spend millions of dollars with you a year for you to continue to support this because we need it for this other thing that is too expensive and too essential for us to replace. Like,
sure.
In a world, you have that problem, right? And Cristin, I'm sure you know this problem much better than I do. How do governments respond to that? There are a couple of things from a policy point of view that I do want to call out. So one, as I said, UK government has this code of practice that it's just proposing. We saw in the US National Cyber Strategy that there was talk of secure by design, and we've seen CISO come out with a proposal. We've seen a pledge. I would love to see this pledge go into adoption into sectors that are not relevant to security. And not to suggest that security isn't relevant in every sector, it is, but I would love to see sectors, technology manufacturers that don't think of themselves as security adjacent, adopting this. And I would like to see what the pledge actually means in practice and how people are actually implementing what that means. But I think it's a good starting point. We saw the national strategy also sort of do a do about software liability, as if that might be a thing that sometimes comes into the future. Now, what's really interesting on the topic of software liability, and I bring this up because, as Jessica already mentioned, there are lawsuits happening, is the EU has a little thing called the Product Liability Directive. And they're in the process of updating it right now. It's actually been formally adopted by the Parliament, but it hasn't actually been enacted yet. The update has a bunch of stuff in it, but the number one thing is that software is now included. So that's right, everybody. That means the European Union now has software liability. And nobody's talking about it, which I think is kind of fascinating. I mean, it won't get implemented for 2 years, but it's still really interesting that that's a thing. So that's happening. And then
actually not surprising, Jen, nobody talked about vulnerabilities having to get reported to the European government, and that got passed.
Maybe it's just the circles I sit in, but I feel like that got more airplay. I heard about that more.
I do think you're right.
Because I had I work on EU policy and I hadn't heard of the Product Liability Directive until really recently. And they've been working on this thing for a couple of years to update it. So kind of shocking to me. And I think in the context of CrowdStrike, very interesting. One of the things that's interesting about the PLD is you don't have to have been a customer of the software to bring a case. You just have to be impacted and by impact, they have like a level of harms, but it could include things like missing a flight potentially. Anyway, so that's one thing. And then just going back to the UK kind of practice, one of the things that I found really interesting in light of CrowdStrike is a lot of the conversations we've been having now. And again, maybe this is because of where I sit. I'm very cybersecurity oriented, but a lot of conversations we've been having around cybersecurity. So the UK's code of practice for software resilience, this is only proposed, it's very early stages, doesn't really talk about outages. And if anything that we've learned from CrowdStrike is that outages, you don't need a malicious actor to cause mass disruption and huge economic impact. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how policymakers are going to go back to look at what they've got or what they're working on to think about how they can start working in more reference to the idea of these outages.
No, I think you're raising good points. And I know in a future episode, we're going to talk about something that I really struggle with is this concept of national technical debt and the need for us to be able to articulate how we have all of these legacy systems that we need to be able to deal with. But coming back to CrowdStrike, Jen Easterly said at Black Hat last week that the key takeaway was the need for cyber resiliency. And, when you're balancing liability and we're seeing class actions come in, I'm curious, Jess, from the perspective of an attorney, if you're advising companies, how are you balancing resiliency and obligations? And how would you think about advising companies and managing some of those legal risks? Because at the end of the day, they're still your vendor and CrowdStrike is still a major player in the space.
I think stepping back a little bit, what we're seeing in the situation with CrowdStrike and Delta in particular is a new tech, complex legal issue that actually rests on an ancient legal concept. The questions that's going to come up in the legal process, can CrowdStrike show it met its contractual obligations? And that gets into some of the things that Jason and Jen were just talking about. And if it did not meet its contractual obligations, did it show gross negligence and willful misconduct in a way that would override any liability limits in Delta's contract? What that really means is in the contract, there were limitations on how much, if something happened, CrowdStrike would have to pay Delta. It would have been in the single digit millions. And I think Delta would like to add a few or maybe many zeros to that limit. And I think that's what you're going to see play out. Now, that's a high bar to meet. And if you're a general counsel or a board member or in the C-suite, bringing a lawsuit and making these claims doesn't come without risk. The risk includes increasing whether they're going to be likely, and there are already here, shareholder and customer lawsuits being brought against the company itself. Any short fillings that come out in this lawsuit could bolster those cases, and you have to think about those risks if you're thinking about bringing them. At the same time, if you don't do anything, you're leaving the company without any defense on why they shouldn't be held liable. There's no one else to point to as being at fault. So as you're thinking through this as a legal professional, you have to think first, and there will be this, as we've already seen, questions raised about, does my company have an overall IT health that can withstand any kind of lawsuit? Do we have resiliency? Do we have redundancy? Do we have mitigation plans in place? Can the company realistically expect a vendor to guarantee 100% technology success? Assuming, this gets into that question we were just talking about, that the vendor followed reasonable protocols and testing before deploying its update. And then second, like in this particular instance, given the massive scale of what they're calling the most epic fail, I think that's what CrowdStrike accepted as an award last week at the recent DEF CON conference, that it was the most epic fail award. Now, did the company afterwards put in proper recovery steps? And I think this is what you're seeing come out as CrowdStrike's argument against is, how did the peer companies in similar situations respond? You're seeing CrowdStrike saying, we offered you help, but you didn't even call us back, and everyone else recovered faster. That also creates additional legal issues and risks that you have to think about as a company if you're bringing something forward. And it also creates a crisis comp situation with customers and others, because now you have a reputational issue that you weren't able to recover and everyone else did. So I think those two pieces of legal posture we're going to continue to see, and that's going to be something you see in almost every case, whether it's the most epic fail or less. All around, it just shows what has always been a problem with the network technologies and efforts to secure them. There's always going to be a weakest link, and the evolving nature of the updates and technology application actually means that there's not just one link, but numerous, and they all interconnect and interact with one another. So the legal questions in the end is, who's most liable and how do we mitigate it all?
I have to say, electing to sue Microsoft on top of CrowdStrike is a really bold move by Delta, because if you want to talk about a vendor who's going to know where all your bodies are buried on your bad IT practices, it's going to be Microsoft, right? Like that's, and you've seen some of that, in the letter that was sent back about, hey, they said they were good and on and on. But the reality is that discovery on this is going to be wild. And I think Delta's about to learn, if they move forward with this, they're about to learn a lot of uncomfortable truths about their own IT practices that made their recovery so very gnarly. And I think that's the interesting tension here. And Jen, you brought it up a bit, talking about software liability. I'm of two minds on software liability, right? One is that we can't have nothing forever that has not worked out for us so well. Like there needs to be some sort of incentive to do better and invest better. But then the flip side of it is, who's going to pay for that? And it can't all be like, there's not enough money in all the vendors to pay for that. And you're not going to have companies who are willing to sell software at $3 an endpoint when they're taking on $1,000 of liability an endpoint, right? Like that's just like, there is no economic formula in which that works out. That's just completely infeasible. And so this uplift that we would need to reach that state where we could have reasonable cyber liability regulation, like that's not all going to come from the vendor side. And I don't know that the customer side of the equation really understands how much of that is going to be on them. I work at a company that sells patching, and I've seen prospects say, it's not really in the budget, so we're not going to patch any third-party things on user endpoints. We'll just go to user-driven and tell them that they should be doing it and put it on auto update and hope for the best. And it's wild to me that that's where we are in 2024, but they just plain out do not have the money. That IT department is not funded to buy that. And so this is not a bunch of nerds sitting in the corner arguing about who should pay for what and who should do what. This is talking about a fundamental realignment of the modern technology-enabled economy. And I don't think that governments even understand what it is they're talking about, not to its full extent.
Yeah, that endpoint math is a hugely important point. I also think it's a fascinating thing. SolarWinds happened right after Thanksgiving in the United States and ate up December. And we were all home during the pandemic, locked in our spaces where there was really very, very little going on. CrowdStrike's incident hit the weekend before President Biden announces he's not running for re-election. Kamala Harris steps into the space. Then we have Congress heading out for its August recess and the Olympics. If there was ever a time to have a major cybersecurity incident and not be in the headlines, that's it. I mean, it's just a fascinating stroke of luck almost for CrowdStrike that there were so many other news events happening at the same time that I'm wondering if this is also distracting a little bit from the hearings, the conversations that will or should be happening now, or if we're going to still see the hearings, still see the questions that need to happen to the questions about liability, who carries the responsibility, what are the effects of patching and some of the implications of the downstream effects of this? Or do we think that because we're coming into an election year and Congress is going to be so busy in the fall, that this is not going to get the full DC treatment that it would in a normal year? Thoughts?
There's always this thing that people say in security about how, that you wait until it's like end of day on a Friday to announce your breach, right? Not that I'm thinking of any specific companies that would ever do a thing like that. I think all of the factors you mentioned helped the news window to move on. But the reality is, I think the news window moves on stuff like this anyway, really quickly. I don't think tech stories hold the imagination of the public for very long unless there really isn't anything else going on. And in truth, I don't know about the US, but it was a huge story in the UK. We had a good week of it being a big story here. And then, yeah, you're right. The Olympics started and people were busy talking about whether it was a parody of The Last Supper or not. And so it moved on, right? But I think that they had their really rough news news window. And I think that it will come again, right? Because the lawsuits will perpetuate it. You're right that in terms of a congressional response, I have a question mark over whether that will happen or not because of the fact that you're heading into an election. But I have no doubt that other governments are looking very closely at this issue. I'm fully aware that they are. I hear from my own government, but I also hear about other governments potentially looking at this. And so I don't think that they're going to escape government scrutiny and response. And as I said, with the fact that the EU has already done the work on the Product Liability Directive, I can only assume that they are going to also be looking at this and figuring out what they want to do about CrowdStrike. So I don't think CrowdStrike's time is done yet in terms of the public scrutiny on this. I think it will come back. And, just in the interest of fairness, I mean, I don't want to wish anyone a bad day, but I kind of hope that they do have a hearing because SolarWinds had to. And I suspect that we've not heard everything yet. I mean, remember, one of the most shocking things about SolarWinds was the SEC's decision to bring a filing and specifically to name SolarWinds CISO as part of that and to specifically target him. There was a delay before that decision was taken. That was not straight away. So we may yet see whether the FTC or the SEC or any other administration entities want to take action on this. I suspect at the moment there's a lot of people having conversations behind closed doors and figuring out what the right approach and response will be.
Jess, you live in this world. Any thoughts?
I think there's a lot to watch and see. Right now, everything is so distracted because of everything else going on in the political sphere. I don't know if the timing, just to your earlier points about the timing of this, that may go in favor just because there's not much time left right now.
Well, let's move on. I want to talk about cybersecurity and AI regulation. This is an area where we have spent 20 years with a lot of best practices, and we didn't have a lot of regulations. I remember as a baby lawyer, I always used to be so jealous of my privacy colleagues because they had all the laws and we only had best practices. I felt like, wow, they get to enforce things and I only get to ask nicely. But then I realized over the course of my career what a gift that actually was. And so now that we actually have so many cybersecurity regulations coming into force around incident notification, vulnerability disclosure, baseline security requirements, and more sector-specific requirements coming up, it's really changing how we think about cybersecurity. And I think companies, CISOs, CEOs, boards, GCs, we're all wrestling with what compliance looks like as more and more laws are coming into force. So I use that as a backdrop because I find it fascinating how AI is absolutely exploding into our sphere. And the number of laws and policies that are being developed that are impacting cybersecurity from the AI perspective is just amazing to me. And so I wanted to just hear, and I'll start with you, Jen. What do you think regulators and policymakers are getting right about the need to start to regulate AI, based on the fact that it took so long to let cyber grow and percolate that we had to start so much faster on the AI side?
Yeah, I think the thing that prefaces all of this is that we have to remember that we're talking about two separate but concurrent development life cycles that move at dramatically different paces. There is the technology development and there is the development of policy. And when you're trying to do one to address the other, and the one that moves faster is the one that's trying to be addressed, you have a challenge, right? You have a huge challenge on your hands. And I give the EU props for the fact that they tried to get ahead. They tried to start early with their EU AI Act, and they thought they had done the work and they were done. And then ChatGPT came out and they were like, oh, what's generative AI? And I feel kind of bad for them about that, right? Because they were trying. They were trying to get ahead and they were trying to be, aware of the fact that we have a legacy problem and that we didn't get ahead in other areas and that it's created this debt. what that process highlighted is there is a chicken and egg problem. Policymakers can, with the best will in the world, want to identify potential future issues and can want to get ahead of them, and then can go, well, this didn't go in the direction we thought it would. Now what do we do? Right? Because that's kind of the point of innovation. Innovation is about pushing boundaries and developing new things. And you can't, we have an unknown unknowns problem here. So I think for policymakers, it's super hard to get ahead of this. The things that they're doing right is they are trying to get in at the ground up, but they're also trying not to do it in a way that blocks themselves in or causes more harm than good. I mean, when you're looking at AI policy, you've got to think about, firstly, it's not just about cybersecurity. In fact, I think cybersecurity is a secondary factor, and the primary factors should be much more around what can we be doing? What should we be doing? How do you make sure it's reliable? How do you manage data sets and avoid bias? I mean, really fundamental foundational stuff, right? And so firstly, what they're trying to cover is broad. There's a challenge in that as a government, your responsibility is to grow your economy, stimulate your economy, and support the economy, while also minimizing risk and harm for your nation and your citizens. When it comes to AI, it puts a massive spotlight on the friction that exists in a problem like that, right? Because how do you, on the one hand, say, we support innovation in AI, we want to be the world's leading on AI development, but, we're not going to do it in a way that has any potential harm or that introduces new risk. There's a huge friction there. So I think what policymakers are trying to do is, the things they're getting right is they're talking to each other internationally. And I will say, from a point of view of cyber policy, I've seen a massive uptick in the level of international cooperation between policymakers in the last 5 years. And I think that's wonderful because we have a global digital economy. And if we want to continue to have a global digital economy, we have to try and think about how we harmonize policy as much as possible. There are limits to that. It's very likely that China will not want to set the same ground rules that the UK wants to set, for example, that the tolerances for approach, philosophy, risk, appetite will be different. So there are going to be limits on what they can do in terms of international cooperation. But I think international cooperation, to the extent it exists, is one of the things they're doing right. I think trying to get in early, but at the same time, not trying to jump to conclusions is one of the things that they're doing right. I think working with experts and trying to really work with a variety of experts, whether they're cybersecurity experts or AI developers or, all sorts of different people, I think that's the thing they're getting right. And that's probably the limit of what I have to say on that. Because
I have to add something to that. I think we're seeing more of a nexus on the regulatory and legislative front between AI and privacy as opposed to AI and cybersecurity, at least in some of the early conversations that are happening. We saw this in the
Which
US.
I think is appropriate, by the way.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. Because you saw that in the US. There were hearings happening in July in the Senate Commerce Committee. The experts and the people there were testifying. We don't have they're trying to get privacy laws through. We need it because it threatens personal data security and ethical AI practices. Those were the two elements that were present. And the need for this activity and action to safeguard those rights and have transparent frameworks for developing those AI systems. I think you're seeing more conversations. You're seeing it, I think, in the EU with some of the Digital Services Act, DSA rollout that we're seeing and some of the questions that are coming from it. I think we'll see it with the AI Act in the EU next year as that starts getting implemented more. So I think that's the nexus that you're seeing. Where you're seeing the nexus on the cybersecurity front seems to be more on the technology side and more on how is AI going to shape us to do better in terms of doing either defending against cybersecurity or having it used against cybersecurity. And so the legislative regulatory activity around that I'm seeing play out is how do we kind of do that from a infrastructure protection standpoint, but less so from a regulatory, what do we need to do to protect this right now, as the same way that we see with the privacy side.
But isn't that a lost opportunity? Frankly, we've had 20 years of privacy on the left, security on the right. And AI is bringing that together in such a new and innovative way. Aren't we missing the opportunity to actually bring security in earlier so that the policy and the regulation becomes more effective, or doesn't matter? I see Jason is indicating yes.
I'm losing my mind because we built computers. We built the internet. we built cloud technologies. We've been building tech for decades upon decades upon decades with the thought of, let's get the thing to work, get it out into the market, get adoption going, and then we'll bolt on security later.
Move fast and break things, baby.
Yeah, and it is not worked out, not by a mile. And then here we have this whole new frontier of computing, and we're doing it again. We're talking about, here's all the use cases and here's the things it can do, and it's all fantasy and happiness and unicorns and rainbows. But almost no one is talking about the safety, the security, the trust. That is the hardest thing that I have with AI as a CISO, is not the regulation, what regulation might be coming down the road. It is that both for my own use case and when it comes to customers, speaking as a vendor, there are some really interesting potential use cases. But if I can't draw them out exactly how I can assure that their data will never be commingled with someone else's data, or someone can't show that to me, then no one's going to buy. And I think that's the problem that the industry is finding itself in right now, is a lot of interesting models out there. Some are kind of looking for a purpose, and it's not as nearly as advanced as I think a lot of average folks think it is. But the safety and security and trust just isn't there yet. And so when I look at things like the EU regulations that I was talking about, biometrics data, distorting behavior, creating social scores, assessing or predicting criminal conduct, untargeted data scraping, great. Those are all wonderful things. But like, those aren't the fundamental things of like, will my data get leaked out to some random person or a competitor? Yes or no, right? Like, the industry can't even answer that. And so I think the regulators and the reality of it are miles apart. And a lot of CISOs and other security leaders are just stuck in the middle saying, what in the world is going on here?
Oh, I think it's such a great point. I think that in the tech sector, to Jason's point, there is a really strong philosophy of move fast and break things. There always has been. People have said it for years as if it's like a great mantra, as if we should be proud of that. I actually think it's terrible, by the way. And I was just having a conversation with somebody else about the fact that we've started telling people that they should have failover systems in place. And I'm like, you don't go to people and say, hey, when you buy that fridge, you should buy two just in case the first one fails. Like, it's insane that as an industry, we think it's acceptable that this is the advice being given out. But anyway, so looking at the AI problem specifically, the industry abdicates its responsibility until it has customers push on it, right? The number of times, and I've worked, as I said, with lots and lots and lots of technology vendors for lots and lots of years. And the number of times I've had people say, customers aren't asking about that, customers don't care about that. And there's this idea that the customer has to vote, right? The customer has to ask and demand before a company will take action on a thing. That's a failure to me. But at the same time, I've heard AI leaders say it's not our job to decide what we can build and where the limits should be. It's our job to push boundaries. That's what innovation's about, which is some great pretentious nonsense.
There is an opportunity here, because as you're seeing the convergence between all three, which they all, I know, Cristin, you and I have talked for years that they all should have been treated the same, and the expertise should be across the board and not just in silos. But I think we're reaching a point where it's not practical to separate them, whether it's in the legal regime or technology realm. And I think where AI brings in a different element, we're going to have to address it as, traditionally when you're talking privacy and security, just to simplify things, you talk confidentiality, integrity, and availability. But where AI is adding is another layer, which is the veracity of it all. And if you're adding that...
Isn't that integrity?
It is integrity, but I think it brings another element to integrity that merits it being treated a little bit separately, because it gets into the misinformation, it gets into the hallucinations. I don't know if the hallucination element would...
We can have now. The
SIVA. That sounds great. I do too. And if you add the veracity element, then you have to treat all of them the same or together, and have people understand across the realm, because they're not easily separated.
Yeah. Also, Jessica, you made me think when you were saying earlier, another thing about separation is that when we talk about AI and we say AI and cybersecurity, we talk about a lot, AI and cybersecurity. And you were saying earlier, well, okay, but is that about the potential for defenders to use AI, or is it about the potential for attackers to use AI? There are two other buckets that I can identify, which is attacks against AI, and then there's the potential for the impact of AI on the cyber workforce and what the long tail impact of all that will be. So those four, I can come up with four completely separate, discrete topics that are AI and cybersecurity, that I would come up with a whole different set of talking points for policymakers on each one. And yet we like glom them all together. And then to the point that everyone else has made on this call, and that's before we've even had the conversation about like reliability and data poisoning. And I don't even mean malicious data poisoning. I mean like the fact that the data that we have comes from the internet.
Yeah, trained on Reddit.
It's actually defining AI, because that's the other thing. When we mention AI, we didn't really define it. Are we talking about generative AI? Are we talking about AI as a tool, or what we're seeing in the multiple companies, especially software companies using it? Because that changes the nature of how we look at this across the board, whether it's cyber or privacy or what we want to say AI is.
So it's fascinating. And I think AI needs more time in the best practice space, because part of what's so interesting is to watch how regulators, policymakers, companies, users are struggling with what is it? The technology is evolving so much that's part of the challenge itself. When you talk to people about it, well, how are you using AI? How do you want to use AI? It's like, I don't know. I just know I need it. And so it's interesting. I want to ask a little bit about how, to your point, Jen, as AI is getting more and more embedded, eventually it's going to become more meaningful for offense and for defense. We're starting to hear a little bit more about this. Back in February, Microsoft and AI talked about how the big four were starting to probe generative AI's capabilities for nation state cyber attacks. So nation state bad guys are starting to innovate too. So I'm curious, Jason, how are you thinking about, from a CISO and a defender's perspective, how does the TI community look at the way that nation state actors are going to start using AI? And as a CISO, how do you start thinking about shields up to deal with that?
So it's still early days, and I think that I'm not in panic mode yet, but I do have a few concerns, right? And when you look at what is probably the best known advance in AI right now, it's around large language models, right? That those generative AI models that you give it a prompt and it will give you a wall of text of whatever you want. And probably, unless you're a particularly good native writer in that language, it's probably better than whatever you would have written. So whether you're talking criminal actors doing phishing attacks or pig butchering attacks and trying to just get a marginal increase, or if you're a state actor, if you're doing something that's user enabled, right, where you have to phish somebody or trick someone, a watering hole attack, being able to have that as an assistive tool for generative content is really helpful, right? It's not completely new. And I think some people overestimated what an impact it would have, because they said, oh my gosh, this will just make it so vastly different. And the answer is no, because they have a lot of those types of activities, whether they be state activity or criminal, have a history of malicious content that works, right? They have these libraries, well-worn, trodden true, of things that can help induce a person to click. And so having a better version, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 more versions of that, is a marginal improvement, but it's not a sea change. Now, where I think it really helps out state actors in particular in an espionage context is being able to analyze a massive amount of data that you've received, right? If you get a bunch of data that you've pulled off, being able to analyze that with a large language model to triage and prioritize your exploitation of that data, huge improvement, especially if it's in a language that you don't speak. On top of that, those models get more and more efficient, and you can run those down on the victim systems and now prioritize your exfiltration, right? Another significant improvement again, because you don't have to exfil as much, which means you're that much harder to catch.
Let me ask you though, because one of the things that I was reading about during the Olympics was that they were starting to see some mis and disinformation attacks coming from the Russians. One was a fake video about the games, including one with an AI-generated French president denouncing the Olympics in a music video, which is kind of awesome, and yet still, bad Russia. But one news outlet said that video spread because it had 30,000 social media bots linked to a Russian disinfo group, and that AI then translated that into 13 different languages. So, it spreads it. From a threat intel perspective, what does the threat intel community do with that? Because mis and disinformation is such a different domain from traditional threat intel hunting and disruption of bad guys and attackers. How's the threat intel community dealing with this new mis and disinformation space that AI is really accelerating?
Again, I'm a little bit torn, right? On one hand, being able to have that sort of assistive content lift is significant, right? That is a very limited human skill set, and people are pretty quick to even spot something that comes through Google Translate. As good as it is, as impressive as it is compared to even 5 years ago, right? Most native speakers of a language can spot something that has been run through a standard commercial translation engine and spot it. And that instantly puts them on guard, right? It gives them it's that uncanny valley of language. But as these things continue to improve, and again, as there's different ability to add particular variations, to catch inflections, to do it with voice and not just with text, that is personnel and investment that actor can now put into other areas. And so that aspect worries me a bit, because there is no threat actor in the world, even NSA, who doesn't operate without a budget, right? Everyone has a budget. Everyone has some level of resource limitations. And if you can offload entire segments of your workforce over time, right? I don't know that you can do it all today, but you can certainly lessen it today. And as you can offload that over time and convert those seats into other areas that are more labor intensive, that increases the scope and scale of your operations. And so from a defender's perspective, I'm worried about 5 years down the road when the curve starts catching up of, do we see even more activity that we just really cannot get ahead of?
I do love the thought of nation state actors having to sit in budget planning meetings. Yeah, Jess, any final thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I just wanted to, on the last question that you asked, so people listening may be aware that the UK had some rioting recently. And there was a story about one of the particular riots that targeted a library, a community library, and set fire to it, which is pretty horrifying to most people who are not complete morons. And the news interviewed a woman who worked at the library, and she was explaining that the reason that the library had been targeted was that there was a disinformation campaign on the internet that said they had taken all of the kids' books out of the children's section and replaced them with copies of the Quran. And what the woman said, and I thought she said it so brilliantly, because she was much, much more polite than I would have been, is she said, I think there might have been a little bit of a lack of critical thinking there. And I think that summarizes the problem that we have is, to Jason's point right now, the people who really need to evaluate the veracity of stuff, which apparently is not, society at large, are able to, because you can see things that are obviously wrong. Where I think we have a challenge, though, is that there is a real lack of critical thinking that's happening already with really basic stuff. And so I think what that does is it pushes us along a path where people eventually just stop looking for truth, or they're only interested in echo chamber. And we stop seeking the critical thinking, right? And people who are paid to do it, the people who, whose job it is to tell, they'll always do the extra homework. And then it becomes about whether the technology makes it much, much harder. But I think we've got a challenge already around this issue of the technology today is actually good enough to already get past the base requirement critical thinking, which apparently seems very low. So I do think we've got a real problem here. And what I worry about is whether it'll take us to a point where we just don't believe anything anymore, or we default to only believing the stuff we want to hear. I don't know. I think it gets much harder.
I think the reach issue is one too that is going to get it's been bad, but it's going to get even worse. Because the way I envision and having worked in this area is you really kind of have, you look at it as like a Venn diagram. If you close your eyes and imagine misinformation is down in one corner, and that's really just rumors, conspiracy theories, things that people aren't maliciously doing. They just start spreading rumors. And, people by their nature like rumors, most people at least. Then you have the disinformation where you get into the Russian actors and others and who are really trying to spread that. That's the news that's not true. That's, making it seem like it's valid and undermining existing authorities and institutions. And then you get into this weird area, which, for lack of a better term, is where propaganda has been used by governments and people forever. And that some of that fits into the misinformation, disinformation, but some of it is really based on fact, and it's twisting the facts. When those three come together, that middle area is where the problem is. And that's where people no longer are able to decipher between the three. And also then run into problems of, I don't trust any of these institutions because a lot of the movements we're seeing, authoritative movements, the populist movements, have undermined those institutions. So you have that. We've seen this play out in the social media space where misinformation, disinformation gets spread even more because it's not just me going and yelling at a corner or at a family dinner. It's now going to millions and you can make it go viral. Now, what scares me about AI is the ability to use AI at bots, other things to spread it even more, create fake accounts on social media, things like that, which increases the opportunity to do it that which previously was manual or had some pieces of it, but AI just amplifies it even more. So how do you address that? That's what scares me the most, is all of those things coming together and then there's no easy solution.
Yeah, what you said, I agree. All of that.
Wow. Okay, that was quite an hour conversation. I can't thank you all enough. And I think that the disinformation and misinformation topic, particularly around AI, is one that we'll have to come back and revisit in a future episode because there's simply too much there for us to not want to come back and unpack. So, Jess, you just teed us up so brilliantly to have to come back and really think about that a lot more. So thank you all for listening to Advancing Cyber. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion. I know I sure have, and I hope we've advanced cyber a little bit along the way. I want to thank our guests, Jess Herrera-Flanigan, Jen Ellis, Jason Kikta, and our Advancing Cyber team with management support from DC Cyber Communications, our sound engineer and third-year law student, Tanner Wilburn, and our undergraduate research interns, Layla Moeller and Carolina Oxenstierna. You can share ideas and communications via cyber@advancingcyber.com. Security is a community, and we always look forward to hearing from you. This is your host, Cristin Flynn Goodwin, saying thank you, patch your devices, and please turn on MFA.